All right, I'm joined now by Locky Lockerson, who's a new Bang the Book writer, joined us a few weeks ago, also has his own site, LockyLockerson.com. And like I said on yesterday's show, it's up to you to decide whether that's his real name or not. But Locky, how's it going today, man?
Pretty good, Adam. I think I can, spoiler alert, that Locky is not my real name, but doing pretty well. I know a bunch of your guests like to tell you how warm it is in Las Vegas and it's a sunny afternoon, whatever. It's like 30 degrees in Connecticut right now, but I'm wearing pajamas inside on a Monday afternoon talking about gambling, so that's pretty good.
Yeah, you can't beat it. I mean, I get to wear pajamas or sweatpants to work every day, so I'm totally cool with it, and I know exactly where you're coming from. And we're going to talk some future stuff here on today's segment. That's what Locky covers for us over at BangTheBook.com. His first college basketball piece out early last week, college football and NFL pieces on the regular here. And I guess let's start with the college football playoff. And a lot of people are rooting for chaos. You and I were talking before we started recording here. The people may not get what they want.
Yeah, I mean, I think people in general like to see chaotic sports situations play out. I think that's more fun. I think the TV viewership gets better. I think it creates really good water cooler discussion. But especially this past week, I think you got clarity in terms of big game matchups. But the 2 weeks before that, when sort of random teams were losing and things got, quote, unpredictable, I think really what you saw that happening with was teams in the middle tier, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, actually became less valuable to bet on. With the exception of Auburn. And then your top four teams, I think actually just kind of even more solidified claims to playoff spots. So, for example, you know, can Alabama lose and totally be fine? That's a question that a lot of people are asking. I think the answer is yes. I'm not sure it matters who they lose to unless it's Mercer. But I think, you know, what you're sort of seeing is like fake chaos. So the way that manifests itself is, if you like a team, so we're recording this on a Monday, Tuesday night, the playoff is going to come out. It's going to be in some order, Alabama, Clemson, Miami, Oklahoma. Where they put Miami is pretty irrelevant because Clemson and Miami are going to play anyway. I think the distance between those teams and other teams is much larger. Auburn is the only chaotic team that even has a chance. And we were talking off air about Five Dimes has a prop up, which has actually apparently been taking a lot of money. Will a 2-loss team end up making the playoff? And then I think you were saying that the no for that has actually been that down from high twos to something like minus 210, 215. To me, that's a little crazy. I think the only realistic 2-loss team with a chance to make the playoff is Auburn. Their path is still pretty difficult. It still involves winning at Alabama. It still involves winning the SEC championship against Georgia at that point. I think the likelihood that that happens, or the likelihood like of less than 1% that something like Ohio State making it happens, I think the no on that is actually a pretty strong bet because there are still undefeated teams that would have a much more rightful claim even with one loss.
Well, here's the thing about the 2-loss team. And look, if Auburn beats Alabama and Georgia, I mean, it's going to be them. So that certainly is a possibility. And beating Alabama and Georgia is much easier said than done. But the Ohio State thing is very interesting to me. And I talked about this last year on the shows, and I beat this point to death, but I can do it again here this year. If the committee can find a way to put Ohio State in the college football playoff, they're going to do it because Ohio State is a massive draw. From a money standpoint, not having Ohio State in the college football playoff hurts them. Having Ohio State in the college football playoff is a big deal. They travel very, very well. People love Ohio State or they hate Ohio State. There's not much middle ground with that team. So there's a lot of intrigue to put the Buckeyes into the playoff. If they can do it, if Ohio State beats that team up north by 40 and Wisconsin by 40 in the Big Ten championship game, and they get a little bit of help along the way, something like Oklahoma loses, maybe Alabama runs into some kind of problem, I don't know. But if they can find a way to put Ohio State in it, they're going to do everything in their power that they can because financially it makes sense. And whether people want to believe this or not, the college football playoff is about money, just like everything else in college athletics.
So it's funny because I agree with everything you said, except that leads me to make a bet on the yes in this case. So the funny thing is I totally agree with you. I was actually I guess maybe I'm still a little naive. I thought it was a little surprising that Ohio State, just based off the Oklahoma win, got the spot last year. I was holding like a little bit of Penn State futures, which was kind of unfortunate in that situation. I think I agree with everything you're saying. Ohio State's a huge brand. They're going to draw really well. College football is on some level rigged, for lack of a better term, so that certain outcomes happen more often. When we talk about college basketball, it's actually no different whatsoever. I think the thing is, if you're talking about a line of 215, 220, 230, for that to happen, like there's basically an implied percent. You're saying that, basically I'm betting minus 215. I'm saying I think there's more than a 68% chance that that's going to happen. And I think I'm not sure that that's debatable right now with the way the climate is. Like, I think the likelihood that Auburn gets in and the permutations in which Ohio State gets in, if you add all of those up, I think you still end up with a number that's much less than what the market is saying.
No, I completely agree. And if you think that Auburn is the only two-loss team that can make it into the playoff, well, just go ahead and play a money line rollover in their game against Alabama in the Iron Bowl and in the SEC championship game, and you're going to get paid much, much healthier than you would the plus 165. So that would be the way that I would play it if you truly believe that Auburn is the only two-loss team that can get there. And I think a case can be made for that. I mean, Ohio State getting blown out by Oklahoma and Iowa doesn't really look good on their resume. So that'd be the way that I would play it, is just roll over the money line on Auburn, and that's the way that you'd get a two-loss team into the playoff, and you do a lot better than plus 165.
Right. I totally understand. One thing, I was actually talking to somebody today, and I referred to this time of year as open parlay season, and I guess this is a perfect segue for me to explain what I mean by that. So basically, the futures market, for lack of a better term, can be pretty dead this time of year. The numbers are like pretty low on most of the teams. There isn't a lot of value with so few games left. A team isn't going to sneak up and all of a sudden in week 10, we're going to say, oh, that team's really good, they should be in the playoff. It just, obviously that doesn't happen. So, what you end up with is, especially in a lot of the shops that have less profitable futures, where the numbers are maybe like shrunk a little bit intentionally, what you get are prices like, I think I saw one place, which I won't name, had Auburn 10-1 to win the title, Wisconsin 15-1 to win the title, even Miami, Clemson, Oklahoma, which you would assume are pretty flat at this point, plus 450, something like that. And what you have to play that against is, as a gambler, all the tools in your arsenal. Okay, you have the ability to make that futures bet, but you also have the ability in a lot of places to create an open parlay. And I mean, especially, there are a bunch of teams this applies to, but if you would like to bet on a team to win the title, and they have to win every game from this point forward in order to do so. Obviously, they'll have to win the semifinal and the final in the playoff. But if they have to win every single one of their games to get there, and then win the games to win the title, an open parlay is almost 100% going to be more profitable in those situations. So the teams that applies to would be Clemson, Auburn, Ohio State, Wisconsin, teams like that where if they lose, it's done. Oklahoma, same thing. So basically, if you like one of those teams, like let's take Clemson, they're going to be huge favorite at South Carolina. They're going to be small favorite in the ACC championship against Miami. Then you have the two semifinals. Like, you're putting those together, you're going to get better than plus 450. You just are, because the semifinal odds this year are probably going to be pretty short unless a team like Wisconsin makes it. So, I mean, really got to ask yourself, when you bet a future, one of my big things to people is, why are you betting this? Is it, you're betting it because you think the team will actually win and you just want to hold on to it, in which case an open parlay is 1,000,000% a better option. Are you holding on to it because you think the price is likely to drop really soon and you're going to play the opposite way for arbitrage? Then that's a totally different market. That's a totally different set of criteria. You're basically just price grabbing at that point. But, for a lot of people out there, they're looking at a sheet, they're figuring out who they like. I think knowing about open parlays is a really good weapon for them to have in their arsenal.
No, I completely agree. And it's sort of a little bit like the money line rollover concept that we talk about in conference tournaments for college basketball and also the national championship, because that's generally a better way for you to go than looking at some sort of futures price. Because like you said, you have this opportunity to just get a bigger profit margin on the initial investment that you've made. One of the nice things about the money line rollover when it comes to something like this or something like the NCAA tournament is that to hedge, you just stop betting it, as opposed to having to play the other side, figure out the math with that. You can just stop betting it. So there are a few different ways to attack this college football playoff thing. And what's nice is that, you do have a situation where a lot of these teams look like they're going to be locked into their playoff spots unless something really crazy or really fluky happens. So it gives you a little bit more of an opportunity to, find alternative betting options out there over the last couple of weeks here of the regular season. And then, of course, on into the conference championship games. So let's look at the four teams that are probably in right now. You've got Alabama, Miami, Oklahoma, Clemson should be the top four here in some way, shape, or form. Wisconsin's probably 5 to me, even though they're undefeated, just because they don't have the body of work, and their big test will come against Ohio State in the Big Ten championship game, assuming the Buckeyes do get there. So do you feel like any of these top four teams do have value right now?
So it's interesting. I do think in an odd way, I do. So the 2, 3, 4 teams you mentioned, I think, obviously when you're betting futures, you want to try to identify teams headed into significant matchups, grab them before that with the likelihood that you think they're going to win. And then on the back end, the price goes down a lot, right? So that's pretty obvious. I think a lot of people know that. So with that in mind, obviously, it's safe to say the value has pretty much been sucked out of Miami and sucked out of Oklahoma at this point. They just played their biggest games of the year. They just looked as awesome as they can look. Oklahoma goes from 15 down to now I'm seeing like that they're the second choice, basically, something in like 4, 5, 6 range. You're talking about Miami now, like hashtag turnover chain is basically streaming all across America. Like there's going to be no value there. The funny thing is, I kind of think there might be value on Alabama right now. I think you can find Alabama at +1s, mid +1s in a couple spots. You can find them in the form of props, them versus the field, other kind of things. I think Alabama at plus money might actually be pretty good here. And the reason for that is just sort of the narrative of the Alabama linebacker injuries, the Mississippi State game in which maybe they looked a little, even with Mississippi State for a lot of that game, which I guess would surprise a lot of people. I think there's sort of been a narrative crafted that they're vulnerable. And right now, I don't know if I see a team that can really go toe-to-toe with them, even with the injuries of some of the defensive positions. And the other thing with Alabama is they're not eligible for this open parlay, right? So you're trying to match odds. You're trying to kind of do the math. Alabama can lose a game, which, by the way, would lose you your open parlay. They can lose a game and be fine in a lot of situations. They get to the SEC championship game undefeated and they lose to Georgia. I think they're still good. I think it creates an interesting conversation about Georgia, but I still think they're fine. So in a weird way, Alabama at plus money right now with the idea that if they were to, again, look dominant going forward, Saban with more time off going into the playoff, I think you could still see some pretty big Alabama numbers. If you get Alabama, Wisconsin as a 1-4, all those kind of things. I think it sets up hedge value. I think Alabama at plus money might be a good idea right now.
Yeah, Alabama right now, plus 135 at 5 dimes, plus 120 at BetOnline. So again, like anything else with futures, listeners out there, you want to make sure that you're shopping around for the best price. That's a good reason to have multiple sports books at your disposal. And Locky, let me ask you this then. The Iron Bowl, the look-ahead line right now, Alabama minus 3.5 against Auburn. I'm very interested to see what happens with that game, because if Auburn does beat Alabama, winds up going to the SEC championship game, can you really make a case to keep an 11-1 Alabama team out of the playoff? I mean, when you look at their body of work, that win over Florida State really doesn't look like much of anything now, and that's not their fault. It's just that Florida State had some injuries, ran into a pretty rough set of circumstances, didn't look great against LSU, didn't look great against Mississippi State, but still, an 11-1 Alabama team can't be kept at home, right?
I really don't think so. That's sort of one of the permutations that plays into me liking them so much at plus money, is that there are so many ways this season can play out now that are totally okay for them and put them into the playoff. And, oh, by the way, once they get into the playoff, they're basically a favorite against anyone, which sets up awesome hedge opportunities, live betting, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, we talked a lot. You had a sort of a riff about Ohio State earlier. This is a name brand team. The committee is going to go out of their way to place them whenever possible. They draw well. People watch them on TV. I think Alabama and Saban is a chip that they want to use here. Like if it's Alabama and Wisconsin, if it's Alabama and, Miami ends up losing to Clemson and Alabama loses to Georgia, whatever it is, like if you're stacking teams up against each other, I understand that Alabama's non-conference wasn't very good. We thought Florida State would be awesome. It turns out everybody got hurt, et cetera. I think Alabama's conference games obviously haven't told you a lot. They're playing scrubs in the second half against everybody, but they have a win at Mississippi State. If LSU keeps playing better, Mississippi State closes out well. I mean, I don't think you're going to be able to look at Alabama at the end of the year against most of the teams you're thinking about matching them up with 4, 5, 6 for who gets in. I think you're going to side with Alabama every time. And if the tiebreaker is that they're Alabama, then so be it, but kind of know that going in.
Well, I'll be really curious to see what happens here in this matchup between Clemson and Miami that we're going to get, because that's a game that, it's going to be win or go home, I think, from a college football playoff standpoint. I don't think there's any way that Miami gets in with a loss, even though they have a fairly decent resume, especially with that victory that they have over Notre Dame. But that's kind of a playoff elimination game that should be a whole lot of fun. And then that's where we kind of create some of these different scenarios. And of course, we'll have to see how things play out going forward in the college football marketplace. But anything else on the college football side from you, Locky, or you want to flip over to college basketball here for a few minutes?
I think just to reemphasize something to sort of tie a bow on this topic that you brought up a little earlier, and I actually want to emphasize this. You bring this up when I started listening to your podcast. You brought this up every time. Now, obviously, it was sort of part of an advertisement, but the idea of just having a ton of outs and, you have people on who are single game bettors, who do power ratings, who just dive in to all of these angles. That's sort of a different approach. A lot of my profit during the season comes from futures and preseason and hedging and all that kind of stuff. Having multiple outs is almost more important for this market than it is for other markets. The difference in a game, obviously, between a half point and a point that you're betting is significant to your long-term sort of ROI. But futures, getting a price that's, if there's a 10-1 and I can get a 25-1, if there's a 20-1 and I can get 100-1, those are things that add up even more. So I would just emphasize, and open parlays. Can I find a shop that has them? Can I find a shop that has them and has lucrative futures? I think those are all things to kind of keep in mind if this is an area of gambling that you're interested in.
No, I completely agree, and that is very important to have multiple outs, because it's not just a matter of the obvious fact that 10-1 is better than, or that 10-1 is better than 8-1, or 25-1 is better than 20-1. That's obvious; everybody knows that. But you also gain some profitability in terms of your hedging margin by having that extra $5 on a 25-1 instead of a 20-1. That's very significant. That makes a huge difference when you start talking about hedging some of these futures as we get deeper into the season. So that's a whole other part of this. And I think that that's maybe something that people don't understand, is that you don't necessarily need your future to win. It'd be great if it does. If you hit the jackpot and get that, that's awesome. But you need your future to get into a position to where you can guarantee profit. That's the most important thing. So that's why it matters so much more if you can get a 40 as opposed to a 25 or something like that.
Right. I totally agree. And I think, one of the things you have to understand about the futures market in relation to other markets is, if you have the odds screen up for the Knicks game, whenever they play, I think they play tonight. If you have the odds up for the Knicks screen, the price moves a half point somewhere. That has a huge ripple effect. The market stays pretty efficient in that way. It's not like you can get crazy middles for long periods of time. It's not like you can play arbitrages with money lines against each other very easily. Or if you do, you have to look really hard and maybe go to some places that are less reputable. In the futures market, there are arbitrages available right now. I could just click and find them. You just have to know how to look. And so, but just what that shows you is not so much that you should be playing those because you're tying up your money for a while. But, if I played Warriors minus 170 to win the title somewhere and I created an arbitrage against some kind of plus money somewhere else, then I'm waiting 9 months to get $20. That's not really that worth it. But just what that shows you is that the market maybe isn't the most efficient thing in the world. So there are going to be crazy price fluctuations. You're going to see value be totally different in other areas. You're going to see the 5 dimes opposite don't bets come in a little bit, inefficiently compared to some prices you see elsewhere. So yeah, in the futures market, shopping around is that much more important.
All right, we'll move over to the college basketball side of things here for a few minutes now. And, I love this time of year for college basketball, not because it's just starting, but which is obviously a great thing. And there are obviously soft, inefficient lines out there in the market. But you get a lot of these games here, these litmus test types of games, these massive non-conference matchups in some of these early season tournaments, or just because teams want to try to strengthen their resumes for the future. So I know one of the talking points that you wanted to talk about here today, Locky, is about betting in different parts of the college basketball season and how bettors can get advantages from doing that.
Yeah, so I think the really interesting thing just that I found when I first started really kind of digging into college basketball, this is I would say year 4 or 5 that I've been doing it very seriously. Obviously, I know that's not the same track record as a lot of other people you have on, but my number one thing when I get into something new is just I try to be as intellectually curious as possible about what makes this sport different. What are the segments that you can break the season into? How do you gain an advantage in those segments? So, any college basketball fan kind of worth their salt kind of knows that you basically have non-conference play, you have conference play, and you have postseason play. And those 3 segments are just completely different. The trends that you see are completely different. whether you want to bet favorites or underdogs and knowing how totals change and all that kind of stuff. It's so different. Non-conference has neutral courts, all those kind of things. It makes handicapping college basketball a lot different than, college football, where you have non-conference and conference, but the emphasis on each game is so much different. It's so much more important, et cetera. So just some things early in the year that I think just would surprise people. So when I first got into betting college basketball and I ran a lot of numbers, just one of the absolutely wild things that I thought, because I come into college basketball with a contrarian mindset. That's how I come into everything. I would come into college basketball and I would think, all right, the season is starting. There's a ton of hype about blue blood programs, big name programs. I would bet that fading them blindly would be a good result. I would bet if I bet against, let's take a subset of Duke, UCLA, North Carolina, Kansas, and Gonzaga. Let's just take that subset. So we're throwing out Kentucky for the purposes of this exercise, but teams where you just have to feel like there's an extra point or two of value on the other side in every game. If I just take underdogs, I have to be good. If you blind bet Duke, UCLA, North Carolina, Kansas, Gonzaga as favorites in the month of November, so non-conference play when the season is just starting, if you just bet on these great teams, you just show up and you think, oh, Duke, kind of like them, I'm going to bet $100 on them. If you blind bet this set of teams, you hit 60.2%, and you've had one losing season in the past 12 years. That absolutely blew my mind. So I think part one of college basketball is understanding that the approach that you take in other sports does not necessarily apply to the non-conference portion of this season. And that in a lot of cases, you're talking about these blue blood programs against smaller schools. Basically, everyone's starting fresh, no matter how many starters you're bringing back. Everybody needs time to gel. And when you have two teams on the court that haven't had a lot of practice time together, that haven't had a lot of game time together, the more athletic team, the team with the superior athletes, is probably going to dominate that game because the smaller conference school hasn't had a chance to really gel yet. So that was really one thing that, I sort of found interesting as a contrarian. Kentucky, that doesn't really apply to you. They're about 50% any way you cut up the numbers. So, but just, blind betting favorites, huge teams, it actually can be a profitable angle in some situations, and I'm not sure people realize that.
No, that was something that I didn't realize. I'm glad you brought that stat up, and I like the subset of teams that you used as well. You get these national brand teams, and that is something that's very important. A lot of times people kind of look at that and say, well, they lost this freshman and that freshman, and they had a couple of seniors, and they're both gone. So maybe they'll get off to a little bit of a slow start. They have all these highly touted, high school All-Americans and all this, but still, they haven't played together and, this and that. And a lot of times, like you said, it just doesn't matter because these teams are so athletic. They're faster, they're stronger, they're quicker, they shoot better. Not to mention, a lot of times, too, that subset of teams that you mentioned, they're going to play their games at home early on in the season. So they're going to be in friendly conditions. They're going to be playing against teams that may be a little bit overwhelmed by the moment, or they're going to be playing at neutral sites where these kids are used to playing at neutral sites. It's not going to faze them at all. So I think there are a lot of good reasons behind that stat that you gave out, but it is still surprising to hear it because, like you said, we know those numbers are pumped up a little bit.
Absolutely. I mean, it was the most when I ran all the trends, all the numbers for trying to sort of portion out parts of the year and how I wanted to approach them. I would say this was the number one thing that was surprising to me, was that so early in the year you could get so much value on these teams, or maybe not value, but you're at least getting a fair number. And I think one other thing to take into account, and, I do not have sort of the data to back this up as much as with the other stuff, but you're talking about a sport where, I sort of refer to the start of college basketball as it's sort of a soft open, like you would have at a casino where, it's open, but the really kind of the busy time doesn't come until later. That's kind of how college basketball works in terms of public perception, right? So, football is still going on. College football is still going on. The NBA is only getting bigger as years go by. So you're talking about how much money is there really being bet into these games, and sort of how much are lines being shaded as a result of that. When you start getting into February, and then obviously March Madness contrarianism rules supreme, you're going to want to probably fade a lot of these teams in a lot of different situations. I think that sort of the time of the year and the money that's being bet and who's betting sort of also help to shape that trend.
All right, we got a pretty big tournament coming up here, and it's actually on Tuesday night. It's the Champions Classic. It's not really a tournament, just a 2-game rotation here at the United Center in Chicago. Kentucky takes on Kansas. Duke takes on Michigan State. We got some numbers for these games, but Locky, before we discuss these matchups specifically here and kind of break down these 4 teams and these numbers, what would your recommendation be for people early on in the season that see these heavyweight matchups here and probably wind up reading too much into them.
Yeah, I mean, college basketball, one of the differences, significant differences between this sport and every other sport is, to be honest, the irrelevance of the regular season. People that bet NBA that I talk to all the time, this is one of their sort of tried and true complaints, is trying to get a handle on motivation, or, I mean, God forbid you try to model any kind of motivation into teams. It's impossible. And I think early in the season with colleges, what you have to understand is this team is not the team that you're going to see in February, not the team you're going to see in March. This especially is true from a future standpoint. Like you're going to bet a lot more based on ceiling and projected seed than you are that Kentucky struggled with Vermont yesterday, for example. Does that game really tell me anything about where Kentucky's at long term? No, it tells me absolutely nothing. Does it tell me that short term they're having trouble figuring out rotations, who should be the right starting five, who should play together at crunch time? And does it tell me that Vermont came in with a lot of returning starters? Sure, it tells me all those things. So when you get these marquee matchups, I think there's a tendency to just, you sort of read too much into the one or two games you're seeing already. There's such excitement about these games. There's such excitement about freshman players specifically. Sometimes, and I mean, we can get into the first game because that kind of leads me to where I'm going here. Duke, Michigan State, I think we checked the openers are out. Again, we're recording this on Monday afternoon. I believe Duke is a 1.5-point favorite. I like Michigan State at anything plus here. I think that line is actually incorrect. I get where it comes from. I get what shapes it. I was actually surprised to see that Coach K actually has kind of dominated Tom Izzo historically. I think he's won 5 or 6 in a row against him. I think at least one was in this tournament. But the other thing about those games, I mean, you might see that and think, oh, it's got to be a significant coaching edge. That's got to be something schematically. I think you could make a compelling case in all of those games that Duke had a better team, and in some cases a much better team. I believe when the Okafor, Winslow, Tyus Jones team, I believe they played Michigan State, and it was, I mean, it's night and day. I mean, that team ended up winning the title. So I don't think you've really gotten equal Duke, equal Michigan State. I think that to a certain extent, that's what you have here, talent. I think although Duke's freshmen are talented, everybody is pretty much raving about everything that Marvin Bagley does, and rightfully so. He's a monster. I think kind of the first two games, without, sort of digging deeper, you might think that they've gelled, they're playing awesome. I think it's really telling the minutes that Coach K is playing all these guys in the first two games. If you go back to, I don't have it in front of me, if you go back to the second game that they played this season, first game they played this season, the starters are playing 30, 35 minutes a game, again, of a possible 40 minutes. And these are blowout games. The opener was against Elon. Basically, no bench players are getting more than 5 to 7 minutes a game. I think he only went 9 deep both games, maybe 10 deep right at the end. And I think what that tells me is that he's trying to get these guys to play with chemistry and to gel as fast as possible, but they're not there yet. If you felt great about it, then why would they be playing 35 minutes a game against Elon? So I think what you have is a situation where Duke long-term, they're going to be awesome. You have Bagley, you have Grayson Allen, you have Duval. They're going to be awesome. Their ceiling is essentially limitless. They might have the best player in the country. But for this game specifically, I think when you have played basically no second team and you have no depth and you're expecting these guys to play 35 minutes a game against a Michigan State team that is 10 deep with quality players that have reps together. They're trying to work in Jaren Jackson as a freshman at the 2. I get that. But I mean, Winston and Bridges before he got hurt, and Ward and all of the guys that come off their bench, these are guys that have been in the program for a while. I think their depth could really wear Duke out in this game. I like Michigan State a lot, just almost solely based on that fact alone.
No, I think it's a good betting angle to look at early on in the season because it's very interesting to see Duke doing this when, Coach K knows about the talent that he has. He knows about what this team's ceiling is, and he also knows, like you said, that by and large, the regular season doesn't mean a whole lot. I mean, maybe it helps from a seeding standpoint, but Coach K knows he's going to the tournament, knows who he's going to the tournament with. And yeah, 12 of the 73 field goal attempts in that Utah Valley game for Duke came from bench guys. So 61 of the 73 coming from starters. All the starters played 30 plus, as you alluded to. So I think that's a really good angle to look at. Now, the question here is, do you handicap the coaches in a matchup like this? Do you feel like Coach K or Tom Izzo, is going to put more emphasis on this game one way or another?
So I think first of all, it can be a little dangerous in like these super elite matchups to kind of almost have the coaches be a factor at all. In the second game, if we end up talking about that, I'm not sure Cal or Bill Self. Honestly, I'm not sort of insulting them in any way, but I'm not sure that they're good enough to factor one way or the other outside of just having recruited these super teams. With Tom Izzo and Coach K, I think obviously there's a lot more respect for sort of both of their pedigrees. I don't think there's a way to sort of handicap a college team's motivation coming into situations like this. Now, when we start getting into conference play, and I mean, I do think revenge is sort of a factor that's overplayed, but I do think there are certain situations where that at least has to be considered. I think in a neutral court elite game, I think you have to sort of assume motivation is at a max for both of these teams.
All right, let's go to that second game here then between Kansas and Kentucky. And we're seeing right now, and again, as you said, we're recording this on Monday. That's around the 4:30 Eastern time hour that we're taking a look at this. Kansas a 2-point favorite at 5 dimes, a 3-point favorite. At BetOnline, you're paying -15 to lay the 3 there with them. So it looks like as of now, the early action appears to be on Kansas a little bit, with this number going up a tad at BetOnline. Of course, this could very well change by Tuesday morning when everyone's listening to this segment. But you got a preference in this game?
So first of all, just what you just said, the line movement there is, I guess, predictably interesting would be the right way to describe it. So, I mean, we've all watched Kentucky play these two games. I believe they were on national TV even in game one. They might have been on SEC Network or something. But I think a lot of people watched that Vermont game yesterday, and I think a lot of people sort of said, whoa, this team might not be there yet. And that's dangerous. I think that's really dangerous in a situation like this. This is not a series that has gone great for Kansas. I mean, they played a couple classics. I believe last year was a game that went to overtime. Something like 96-90 or something. It was a really crazy game. But Cal historically has played really well against Kansas no matter what freshman he's had. So, I mean, there's definitely not – I don't know if I put a lot of stock in Kentucky for that reason, but it definitely doesn't make me put any stock in Kansas. I think when you just look at this year's version of these two teams, the first game that we talked about is, I think, the best game, and then this game might be the most interesting game because I think we know that Duke and Michigan State to a certain extent are going to be there at the end. I'm not sure both of these teams are going to be there at the end, and part of the reason for that is just who's been playing and how much they've been playing and cohesion and honestly talent. I think everyone just assumes that Kentucky, they got a new crop of freshmen, they're going to be fine. And I think that's really dangerous because in your head, you're picturing DeMarcus Cousins and Karl Anthony Towns and Malik Monk and De'Aaron Fox. And I'm not sure they have that this year. And I think it's dangerous to just assume, especially with a freshman class where Bagley, Porter, who went to Missouri, Ayton, who went to Arizona, like they don't have those guys. They have the next best guys, and they have like 7 of them. But, you know, is Kevin Knox going to be what Bagley is to Duke? I think it's dangerous to just assume the answer is yes. So I think, you know, this game is interesting because I'm not sure Cal knows what to expect from his team in this game. I'm not sure he knows what to expect from them the next month of the season. I think he's literally trying to figure out who should even be playing in this game. And then Kansas has actually some kind of similar problems. I think everyone was really surprised. Malik Newman, who I thought was maybe going to be their best player this year or their second best player, has been coming off the bench and I think played about 15 minutes in their opener. I'm not sure what to make of Kansas either. I'm not sure how much they can score. They lost so much last year, obviously. You know, when you're remembering Kansas from last year, Mason and Jackson were their 2 best players. Devontae Graham, their 3rd best player, is back. There's so many question marks in this game. But one thing that I just, from watching both teams play early on, there's definitely not a lot of flow. There's definitely not a lot of cohesion. Even though Kentucky plays with a lot of pace in these situations, and that can be really dangerous based on what I'm about to say next, I do think the under might be pretty valuable depending on, obviously, we don't have totals opening. Handicapping college opening totals in these matchups is actually pretty tricky for me. But I would say if you could get something 150 or higher, even high 140s, I would be tempted to take a look at it. Kentucky's pace, I think, is going to keep this number pretty high, but I think you're talking about 2 teams that are going to make a ton of mistakes, that are, you know, lazy passes, guys not being in the right spot, Cal yelling a lot and throwing people on the bench. I think these are all things that are going to kind of create a clunky, less watchable version of the first game.
So you talked about the first game, and you said you think both of those teams will be there at the end. Duke right now the favorite, plus 500 at BetOnline to win the national championship. Michigan State plus 550, Kentucky plus 1,000, Kansas plus 1,400. Do these 2 matchups on Tuesday night mean anything to you from a future standpoint?
I mean, the short answer is no. The long answer is every game sort of, to a certain extent, helps form an identity for a team. Last year, a team that I watched a lot early on, anybody that follows me on Twitter probably knows about this, but Oregon was a team that, I mean, I felt like I hit totally right. I was really in on them early on. The market was less in on them, possibly because nobody really got to watch them play a lot early on. And, obviously they got some tough luck with an injury going into the tournament to Boucher, but I think this is a sport more than any other where you can use your eyes and you can use metrics and you can watch the first month or two of the season and still get a lot of value on these teams. I mean, Duke, Michigan State, Kansas, Kentucky, North Carolina, all these schools, the Arizona, which I don't think we mentioned, these are teams that, okay, they're 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 to 1 now. And when we get to March, history kind of tells us that unless one team has literally proven itself to be sort of an undefeated elite composition of players, which I don't think we have this year, then those prices are going to be exactly the same when you get to March. And there's basically no reason to bet any of them right now at, anything 12 to 15 to 1 or less, because, Duke's 5 plus 500, they get a 1 seed, they get a 2 seed. Guess what? They're plus 600 going into the tournament. So if the idea of betting a team now is that you're grabbing a price that won't be available later, these two games won't give you the teams to do that with. That's just not how blue blood programs in the futures market and giving these teams credit for accomplishments they haven't gotten yet. That's just not how that works. Teams that are playing outside of that, that's to me where you gain an advantage. So you try to find a team that's, let's say 30 to 1, 50 to 1, 100 to 1 or higher that you think actually has a much better chance of being a 1 or a 2 seed than their odds are giving them credit for. That's a team that you can grab a price on now with the idea that that price will not be available anymore. So, to sort of seg to our next topic, a couple teams that I talked about on my site and on Twitter and earlier this year that I think have a ton of potential to do that. I think Wichita State is absolutely one of those teams. They're in a different situation than the other teams I'll talk about because historically the committee has not viewed them very favorably, despite sort of immense talent and accomplishments just because of the conference they play in. They moved to a different conference. They play in the American, which has a couple other teams that sort of have designs on postseason success this year. I guess Cincinnati would be the most notable one there, but I think Wichita is still clearly the class of that conference. Every starter back, every notable bench player back, Shamet and Frankamp are your guards. I think obviously when we get into postseason play, we'll talk more about the importance of high quality guard play. I don't think it gets a lot better than that. Coaching, all that kind of stuff. I think that's a price you can grab sort of with comfort that at the very worst, it stays the same. Maybe Shamet gets re-injured, but again, injury luck is the same for every team. I think that's a price that's sort of destined to go down as we get closer to the tournament. Just real quick, a couple other prices that I would say to keep an eye on. I think St. Mary's is a team that could have maybe I say a Gonzaga-like season. I don't know if they're going to make the title game like Gonzaga did, but a Gonzaga-like regular season is absolutely in play for St. Mary's this year. The conference they play in has a couple okay teams, but really this is a team that went 28, 29, and 4 last year. That season is absolutely possible. They're hovering in sort of that 40, 50, 60 to 1 range. And USC, I think, is actually fascinating. I don't know if they're talented enough to really be truly elite like Arizona and Duke are and all these other teams that we sort of already talked about. But if Andy Enfield is really good and they have all 5 starters back and their starters do have talent, this is a team people kind of remember from those wacky tournament games in March. Chuck O'Bannon, Ed O'Bannon's nephew, actually, is their 7th man this year. Probably will end up being more pivotal than that, hopefully, as the year goes on. Derek Thornton, the guy they have as transfer from Duke. This is a team that's like hanging out in the 20, 30, 40, 50 to 1 range. Like, this could be a 1 seed. They're already ranked in the top 15. Like, this team looks like a 1 or a 2 seed, which means that might be a price worth grabbing also.
No, I completely agree, and I'm glad you went to that point. I'm glad you went in this direction because that's what I was going to talk about. What I did mention in my Futures Odds Update piece, and I know you mentioned it in yours as well, that's what you want to do here. You want to look for these teams to where you can grab some line value now because you feel like they're going to just drop in price as the season goes along. And sometimes you're going to be wrong, but more often than not, you're probably going to be right if you're taking shots on 50, 60, 80, 100 to 1 types of teams to where, if they pick up a win in their one big non-conference game, their price is going to drop by $10, maybe $15, right, depending on how big of a win it actually is. So that's what you want to be looking for at this time of the year.
Yeah, and I mean, think about. This almost sounds like an obvious thing. I guess it might not even bear mentioning, but think about how often you have to be right when you're betting plus 300s, plus 400s, plus 500s, and how much the market has to move in your direction in order to guarantee a profit. Having the ability to take shots on teams 30, 40, 50 to 1, I mean, it doesn't take a lot to sort of wiggle the futures market in a direction where if you're somebody who's just grabbing prices with the idea that you're immediately hedging opposite that the second the number moves sort of in your favor, I can't say it's easy to predict which way these numbers will go, but it is easier to predict which way they will go and trying to get numbers in your favor at that sort of tier than it is at the bottom with 2, 3, 4, 5 to 1s and trying to get the market to move in a way where, they're sort of like the Alabama of college football. So, I mean, I think, price shopping on these teams, we both talked about it. It just to sort of tie a bow on this, like compared to something we talked about at the start of the podcast, you have to ask yourself, why are you betting this? Like, what is your purpose for betting this? Aside from just, lighting money on fire, maybe that's your purpose, in which case you can pretty much do that with anything. But if your purpose is really, to grab a number, then those are the kind of teams that you're going to be looking at. If your purpose is that you're going to pick a team just because you think they're going to win it all, so in which case that's, I guess, the stock equivalent of a hold, then there's no reason to do that right now. So I think when you open up the futures page, which I mean, everybody sort of does in their free time, like, I wonder what the title odds are. I think when you do that, it's really important that before you sort of click that wager button, why are you doing this now? And hopefully we've sort of gone over a few of the reasons what some of the motivation might be there.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And we'll throw a shout out to Sports Cheetah, who usually joins us on Tuesday here. Last year, I mean, he had, I want to say something like 20 or 25, maybe even 30 of the teams that were in the field with futures tickets, just because he was grabbing up prices as the season went along. And obviously, not everybody has the bankroll capacity to do that. But if you can isolate 8 to 10 teams, get them in top 4 seeds in each section of the bracket, then you really start setting yourself up for a lot of success if you can find those teams as the season goes along, hit some of those good prices. So, again, that's really the theme that we wanted to push across here is that, yeah, it's great if you hit your 40 to 1. It's great if you hit your 50 or 60 to 1. But if you set yourself up for profit, with this hold of, 4 months now, 4.5 months that it is, that's ultimately the end game that you want to try to achieve here. But good to get Locky Lockerson on the show for the first time here. I know you've got your own personal website. What's the story over there?
So, I mean, for those, there might be people listening to this that say, I have no idea who that guy is. He has no idea what he's talking about. Never have him back again. Hopefully nobody's saying that. If you are and you just wonder what my background is, unlike some of the other people you have on the show, I'm not a professional. I am the most amateur person there is with this. I have a job. I work 60 hours a week. I have a wife and kid and a mortgage. But this kind of stuff is fascinating to me. And I think the futures market specifically is fascinating. If you go over to LockyLockerson.com, you follow me on Twitter at Locky Lockerson. And obviously I contribute some futures articles for Bang the Book. I think discussions about futures markets and ways to take advantage of the things that are available are really fascinating and sort of merit more discussion than they get a lot of the time. So feel free to sort of check out those things if you're interested in that.
I'll tell you what, you call yourself an amateur, but you've got some very, very, very razor-sharp points of view on the futures market. So definitely an asset to have you over at BangTheBook.com, and I encourage everyone to check you out on Twitter at Locky Lockerson. But Locky, thank you so much for your time, man. We appreciate it, and hopefully we'll get you on the show again soon.
Great. Thanks, Adam.